Welcome to Property Quorum. Now, the keynote item will recognise some faces of yesteryear, and as we go on, Chris Gilson of Root Home, of course, Juliette Babouin of Connor Cook, and of course, Master Hamish McClay of Search and Convey. Now, today's topic, as ever, is a bit of an interesting one, or a contentious one, I should say at least. Who owns what when boundaries cause big problems? And as ever, I'm going to start us off with Hamish McClay.
Welcome to everybody on this approaching bank holiday weekend, not just here in the UK, but also in Italy. So we're outside actually in the wondrous sunlit countryside of Dorset, in the New Forest, where we don't appear to have any boundary challenges exactly where I am. However, there are certain aspects about it. Now, when I was brought in all my innocence into the wonderful world of collecting data and making decisions and sort of writing up reports and all the rest of it, I assumed that any plans that I received from it was Her Majesty's Land Registry at the time, were correct. Only to find out that they actually have somewhere on them which suggests that the boundaries could actually not be exactly as on the plan that's actually that is being supplied to you. Now that, to me, when somebody's actually keeping, they're meant to be the major keepers of records, the key holders of all such things, and they say, well, actually we don't really know. It is a bit worrying. So it must be even more worrying when you go to buy up properties, and more in particular if you have to come to a legal conclusion relative to the boundaries of that particular property, which unfortunately Juliette herself has to establish and confirm.
Well, on that note, Juliette Wilcomont, in Juliette's own words, Thursday is the new Friday, especially when it comes up to a bank holiday. So boundaries.
Yes, boundaries. I mean, if you've got a built-up area of property, there shouldn't really have too much of a boundary dispute. I've seen boundary disputes where the land is unregistered, or where it involves like loads and loads of land that needs to be carved out of a bigger site. You tend to have boundaries disputes there. I think what Hamish is talking about is scenarios where neighbors have used land or pieces of land for things, they might be planting trees or using a particular boundary, or just going into someone else's boundary as far as the gardens are concerned. And then all of a sudden someone comes to sell, they do a survey and they actually say, well, actually the boundaries aren't what they are. It's very difficult when you look at a land registry plan to tell if the boundaries are awry or not. I will say in the land registry's defense that they are, and within the last couple of years, they do go out, they do send their mapping teams out to sites to measure, etc. Because what you've got with the land registry is that they say, you can rely on our information. It's good against the whole world. You can rely on stuff that's on the office copies, which means that if you as an individual suffer a loss as a result of relying on this information, you've got a potential claim against their indemnity fund, which protects you. If you discover that your plans are wrong and you've got to have this dispute with your neighbor, there's also a form, I think it's a DB1 form, that you can complete, and you can have a land registry adjudicator come on and determine whose boundary it actually is, or what the rectification requirements are. So that's a very, very handy tool. And I had a client who said to me, if he'd known about that, it would have saved him 26 grand in fees, because he had to go down the legal route with lawyers, mediation, that kind of thing. So there is that service that they do offer. I always say to people, look, if you think the boundaries are incorrect, have a chat with your neighbor. Try to have it as amicably as possible. What you find is that if you can deal with it between yourselves in terms of determining, often it's just a slither of land and it isn't really worth that much. The dispute is going to cost you more than the actual value of the land, which means to take it to court and litigate is disproportionate. So having a meaningful conversation between yourselves and coming to a resolution is by far the best course of action.
Chris, boundaries must be the bane of your life.
Weirdly not, no. I imagine they are for many people. They've caused some issues over the years in terms of transactions we've been trying to get over the line, and people like Juliet have been able to help jump in and try and deal with those situations prior to us purchasing any property. So in some instances it doesn't work out, so it's down to it's down to both parties, as Juliet said, to come to some sort of agreement. And where there's a dispute, then it can all kick off and it'll all go very pear-shaped very quickly. So yeah, one that comes to mind is where we were trying to purchase a property off a housing association, and I think originally it would be one. I think the property was originally on one title, which probably owned by the local authority, and then transferred into the housing association. And obviously, if we're trying to purchase it, we're trying to acquire that particular title out of the larger title. And to do that, you need to be able to define the boundaries. And for some reason, the housing association was reluctant to tell us where the boundaries of the property were. I'm not sure why or what, or that certainly caused some issues for us. But yeah, it happens, and the common one is the party wall agreements and any work on the party wall, and again that can raise all sorts of very interesting disputes. I've heard of neighbours trying to acquire parts of their neighbours' land by installing new fence posts on the neighbouring property side, and suddenly their boundary is extended by 12 inches or so. And again, all hell breaks loose. And it's like, well, the boundary was always there, wasn't it? It's like, no, not necessarily. But then you've got a whole heap of trouble to try and unravel. So it's a complicated one.
Juliet, boundaries are inscribed by the land registry, are they not? So theoretically, you should just be able to go back to them and just grab the original boundaries, and that should resolve all disputes amicably, surely.
Yeah, the problem is when you've been using a boundary for a period of time, in law there's something called prescription and prescriptive rights, etc. So even if it might be somebody else's boundary, you might have acquired rights, or the owner who's been using that, incorrectly using that piece of land, might have acquired prescriptive rights. I often find, for example, if you've got a developer and there's a boundary dispute, then the neighbor thinks, well, the developer's got deep pockets, so I can just try it on. And that's 9 out of 10 times what it is. And if you can work out what will bring this to a close just to get that dispute resolved, that's really, really important. I have seen, it's not so much boundaries, but it's the numbering of properties. So someone split a house into, it should have been 49A, 49B. And right. The land registry registered them the wrong way round. And the sale was a probate sale. Someone had gone to the property and said, you know what, the door number has one number on it, but the land registry's numbering is inaccurate. And we took it to the land registry, and they were able to go back into all of their historical documents. Now, there are documents that you can download for your own viewing in terms of disputes and things like that. But they've got a whole host of information, especially if the land is unregistered and you've submitted all of the deeds. They hold on to those things, and they're able to look into their archives and resolve things for you. And so they'd gone onto this property and realized what had happened. It was just a mix-up in terms of the numbering, and they rectified it, and no one suffered any loss. So I do think that there is that tool that they offer that people need to take advantage of before they look to do anything else, get surveyors out, etc. The historical documents, unfortunately, sometimes, Gareth, they are not the most legible. the writing sometimes is inscripted writing, so you don't actually, unless you get an expert to translate that into sort of typewritten English, it's sometimes very difficult to read. So if there was a particular covenant or clause in relation to a boundary, you may not be able, it may not be legible to just the average person who doesn't know how to read that sort of historic type writing, and they can only go on the plans. And if the plans aren't maintained in a proper working manner, it's very difficult to sort of determine the boundaries. What you do find as well is that you might have a track where loads of people have built up properties, and that track is unregistered and no one knows who owns it. It may not be the local authority, and all of a sudden Mr. Joe Bloggs, who is the relative of the owner 100 years ago, comes up and says, well, actually, I can evidence that this was in my family, this belongs to me, and you all have to start paying me service charges for using this land. And that can happen. I mean, there are indemnity policies to protect against it, but you find that when an original owner split up the land and started selling it off, he will have retained the access way. And when the last piece of land gets sold, if someone hasn't picked up that access way hasn't actually been transferred to someone, it is retained by the original owner. And so that sometimes happens. And that, it would be in everyone's interest if they all sort of pooled together, had their own management company, and tried to buy the access off of this original owner, for example, so they all have control of the access. But that does happen. That sort of is quite common, and I've seen that before many times.
Hamish, so what Juliet's saying is, if we could all just pull together, then all this kind of resolution of boundaries and extent would be solved easily. Surely that's your neck of the woods, sir.
Well, yes and no, but we fortunately we don't need to get involved directly. However, all we can actually do is pull up the most recent plans. There was a transaction we were sort of carrying out just last week, funnily enough, and we put the plans forward. We're trying to get everything together. We actually found out that the title plan was dated in July 2024, not 2025. And in order to be sort of fully up to date, because part of the land, just to make life really helpful, was unregistered. Some of it, so it was partially registered land. When you actually consider out of about sort of 35 acres, only 5 acres were actually registered. It did actually sort of leave something sort of, if you like, something in the air as to thinking, well, why is this and what? But it was, in the end, it turned out to be quite straightforward. But it was that strange thing initially that we could actually only carry out the search on the registered part initially. Then we had to actually encompass the whole of it. But it was very interesting when we came to sell the family home. But my sister got involved with all the various detail on it. But I didn't actually realise that the little sort of passageway to the rear of the property was in actual fact one of those that everybody had the right to sort of cross over, including ourselves, which I hadn't actually sort of realised as a family because it's never been used. But you do find out these things do come out of the woodwork. But fortunately, we have people like Juliet around who can establish such things.
Right. Chris, when you're purchasing properties, and I know you go through the process of identifying suitability of properties and all the rest of it, does boundaries come into that as a normal, or is it usually already sorted out well before you get there?
Yeah, it does come into it. So Hamish's story actually jogged my memory of one bungalow that we purchased quite a while back, and it was originally farms, and then the farmer he's hived off parts of his land and built out basically a couple of different sites for different family members, and then wanted to gift it all to the family. But then we acquired the one in the middle, and there were garages at the back, so shared access rights. And what our solicitor at the time, again, getting fingers burnt, yeah. And she hadn't cottoned on to the fact that well, firstly, it was a small bridge over a brook to get onto the driveway, and then the driveway was all our responsibility, and then there was maybe a row of 10 or 12 garages at the back that the next bungalow over owned and rented out to all sorts of different businesses. So all the traffic that was going over this bridge and all of the driveway, because it was on the responsibility for maintaining the driveway was us, was all on our on our head. So at one point, as we were doing the redevelopment, he came to us and said, "This drive's getting a bit messy. Do you fancy upgrading it?" Like, sorry, what? So yeah, that was an interesting conversation, and some further conversations with our solicitor at the time. But when she managed to dig out some of the records, they're just on old parchment that's almost utterly intelligible to read.
Right.
So yeah, interesting stuff.
So it appears that often this sort of information is inscribed by the Greeks, and it's almost impossible to decipher.
Yeah.
Hamish, would you care to take us home, please, sir?
Right, we will indeed do that. It is one of those areas which, in the majority of cases, there isn't a challenge. One interesting I did actually find, and it was relative to the boundary, but it actually applied to a poor tree, which in fact was stuck almost exactly on the boundary, which had attached to it a preservation order. And unfortunately, birds tend to like trees, and the birds would tend to actually sort of sit on the tree above the neighbour's sort of garden and poop all over their car, which they didn't like. So they had the dispute was not to do with the boundary itself, but to where the tree needed to be cut back so the birds didn't poop on the person's car. But as Juliet said, if you have reasonable people speaking to reasonable people, there is no challenge. Unfortunately, it tends to require two reasonable people. Otherwise, it can get a seriously expensive thing. But it's back to the same old, isn't it? Make sure that you've got the right people working on your behalf, and they will get the situation clarified for you. And speak to somebody like Juliet, for heaven's sake, because if something comes up, she can tell you a good way out of it. Not all the time, because sometimes these things happen, but she will be able to advise. And an effective sort of property lawyer will be able to advise, do this first. Don't go around upsetting people and throwing teddies out of prams and all the rest of it. Speak to people cordially to start off with, and then there are ways of actually resolving it without fisticuffs, or worse still, courts. Because sometimes fisticuffs are all right, but courts cost an awful lot of money.
Yes, well, I think my father always used to say, speak softly but carry a big stick, and never wanted to refer to Juliet as big stick, but she can be as strong a stick as you need her to, given the right circumstance. Thank you one and all to a wonderful meeting here today. It just turns out boundaries are sometimes less easy to discern than you might think, if you can work through the Sanskrit, that is. Until next week, thank you so much, Hamish McClay of Surgican Bay, Chris Gilson of Root Home, and of course, Juliet Babul of Gunnercook, and all you out there, please keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and try and look after that mental health. Until next week, bye-bye.